economy perhaps isn't the brightest spot anymore. We aren't the fastest growing economy as well. In fact, there's a loud clamor for a fiscal stimulus instead. So what should the nature of that stimulus be? What must the government do to revive the economy and create jobs? What must it do with banks, with exports, with telecom, with MSMEs? Can the government afford to listen to fiscal hawks and fundamentalists anymore? Or does it need to step on the gas and pump prime the Indian economy at all costs?
Indeed, our guest tonight is someone who has been a pragmatic economist. His pro-growth, pro-market thinking is what the Prime Minister and the government can make good use of right now. He also heads the jobs panel and will ensure that India's demographic dividend doesn't turn into a demographic nightmare. It is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, in his first television interview with any English news channel after taking over the big role. This is a direct India development debate. I'm Supriya Srinath, and with me in Mumbai is my colleague Sandeep Gurumurthy. We can't thank you enough, Dr. Kumar, and it is such a pleasure to be chatting with you in your new capacity as the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog. So congratulations on the big job. Much luck going ahead in your new role. But I must ask you, you've had the fortune of being a spectator outside, an objective spectator and commentator, and now you have the fortune of working within the government and influencing policy making. Let's talk about the topic under discussion, and that is indeed Indian economy. Growth has crashed to levels of 5.7%. What would you attribute this to? Is this a blip due to demonetization and perhaps anticipation of the GST, or are we really staring at a structural slowdown of the Indian economy?
Supriya, well, one, thank you so much, and I can assure you that it's a great opportunity that the Prime Minister has offered me to be in this job. It's something that the economist, as an economist, it's a great challenge and a great time to be here. On the Indian economy and the growth, I think we should look at it as the as a sort of downturn, cyclical downturn, which started in the last 2 years of the UPA government. This is something that we must note actually, that this is not something that this government it's not co-terminus with this government's coming into office, but the last 2 years the UPA had handed over an economy which had already started to slow down, and where the exuberances, or if you like the excesses of the previous years, where credit was given to all sorts of projects and all sorts of, if you like, infeasible investments, had begun to take a toll on the overall macroeconomic situation in the economy. So, but what I am very happy to say is that I think this downturn, this cyclical downturn, is now coming to an end. The economy seems to have bottomed out in July, July 2017. And by the way, just one other additional fact, which is that if you remember, everybody has been talking about excess capacity in the industry and in the manufacturing sector in the economy for the last 2.5 to 3 years. So if you have excess capacity, you can't expect private investment to go up. But for the first time after July, the PMI in manufacturing is beginning to look up from 47 to I think 51, and the PMI in services too has registered a similar increase. And just one other final thing, which is that the real estate prices are beginning to perk up at long last in some of the metros, and our exports have shown a rise, though not as strong as we would like, in the last 12 months. They're well below their peak, which they reached 2011 I think, but now they're beginning to rise consistently over the last 12 months. I cite all these figures to say we should not think about a structural downturn or a tailspin or disaster scenarios, etc. Yes, we have had a secular decline, but that's a cyclical downturn that we had inherited, and that has continued until now.
Fair point, and I think you've sort of, in a sense, elaborated why you believe a revival is around the corner. But the more immediate concern, Dr. Kumar, is, and you've touched upon it as well, there is concern in the economy on what's going to happen in the next quarter. I know governments can't plan policy keeping quarters in mind, but for corporate India and from a job creation point of view as well, there is more concern on what's going to happen immediately. What is your own view on what's going to happen in the next quarter? Because, for example, the former Finance Minister Palaniappan Chidambaram is of the view that that growth might actually even drop below 5.7%. I know you are far more optimistic. How much of a revival do you see in the next quarter more immediately, and what could be factors contributing to that revival?
I think we would have a fairly smart revival. One is not talking about the so-called V-shaped recovery. I would not expect the economy to get onto a sort of 7-8% growth path, sort of level just now. But given the fact that all the destocking which had taken place in anticipation of the GST is over and behind us, given the fact also that, as I said, finally the private builders have now come around to take advantage of the financial concessions that the government is offering for affordable housing, which is below around 30 square meters, and they're beginning to take up those projects. Also the fact that the automobile sector is now registering a growth, and the festival season is upon us. I would have thought that the July to September, October would register a marginal increase and will take us up above 6%, but then the third quarter is when the recovery would gather speed, and we will probably go to 7% during the third quarter, which will have the festival season within it, and as the economy, then the private sector investment also begins to pick up.
Okay, indeed. So we'll have to wait for perhaps 2 more quarters for the private sector investment to kick in, and that's going to set the virtuous cycle investments in motion. But Dr. Kumar, I do want to shift focus and talk about another issue that has been in the public domain. We at ET Now are big champions of that. We understand that perhaps this is a cyclical downturn. This is going to be, the worst is perhaps behind us. But as the Indian economy begins to pick steam, there is this clamor for the government to handhold. There is this clamor for a fiscal stimulus, for some sort of a lifeline and help for the government to step in with. Why do you believe it's necessary right now?
Supriya, can I answer the question in 2 parts? See, one, I think there is a lot that government can do and is now planning to do to facilitate private investment and to remove some of the bottlenecks, to remove some of the irritants, to remove some of the things which come in the way of clearing the projects, etc. And that itself would enable private investment to come along and to gather a little bit more speed, But the other thing that the government needs to do is also to take care of its own expenses. Now I know, for example, there are several ministries in the government which are not being able to spend whatever has been allocated in this budget. In some cases, quite unfortunately, I think the expenditure is below the level that has been done in the previous year. There are a large number of vacancies even at the cutting edge which have been left unfilled, which will improve public delivery of public services. Now all of those do not require any additional fiscal stimulus, and yet will see a larger outgo of government finances into the economy, and also will debottleneck a large number of projects in the infrastructure sectors especially. The second part, which is I think perhaps equally important, is that at a time when the recovery is about to begin, it will be good for the government to give it a little push by putting in an extra stimulus, whatever it can afford. And what it can afford is something that I have actually held very clearly for some time, is should be determined by not looking at the fiscal deficit number and not getting bogged down by that, but looking at the revenue deficit number. And I believe strongly that the revenue deficit target should be met, in fact if possible even improved upon by measures like direct benefit transfers, by cutting out all the leakages in your subsidy payments, and by doing the jam trinity, etc. So if the revenue deficit is reduced and brought down, and the rest of the government expenditure goes into capital productivity enhancing expenditure, I think there is no harm at all at this point in busting the FRBM target that the government may have set upon itself. After all, the FRBM law does permit a 0.5% sort of expansion above the target in case of the economy needing it. And I think the economy today needs it simply to get the virtuous cycle going as quickly as possible.
Right. And I'm happy to see that you're maintaining your position. You've never been a fiscal fundamentalist. You've never been a fiscal hawk. And happy to see that even in government, you're maintaining your position. So to pick up from the point that you said, do you think then that there is a case, because FRBM Act clearly says that when there is a structural reform, and GST for one, for sure is a structural reform, there is a case to take a leeway and allow fiscal slippage to the extent of 0.5%. Is that something that you would advise the government to go for?
Actually, given the fact that it's not one but two huge structural reforms that this government has undertaken, one is of course the GST, which means that you will have a single economy in this country for the first time without all these interstate barriers and transactions cost, etc. But the more important one also is the demonetization. You see, which means basically that you have an expansion of the formal economy. You have a fight against the the so-called black economy and the parallel economy. Those two major structural changes, which by the way means that your economy today can be on a more open, transparent and sustainable growth trajectory, I think required that the fiscal deficit target could be breached by 0.5% or more, depends on what you need. But the third issue here, which is very important, is that this government inherited a banking sector which is in all kinds of problems, and then upon that you had the RBI insisting for a much stronger, stricter recognition of the non-performing assets and forcing the commercial banks to come up with those numbers. As we know, therefore, by the time you got 2014, several banks and public sector banks in particular were in deep trouble. Now that that banking situation has also to be resolved. Now it can be resolved in drips and small measures going forward. But I am of the view that the time has perhaps come to take the bull by its horn, to confront this problem and improve the banking sector situation as quickly as possible, so that the credit cycle could also take off, which as you know hasn't taken off, and that may require some extra expenditure or allocation from the government beyond the rupees 10,000 crore that has been stipulated in the budget. And if that be so, that is how it should be. I am glad to see that both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have said that they will take care of the banks. I hope that happens soon.
Dr. Kumar, I have 3 or 4 questions specifically on the banking space, and we'll touch upon that in just a bit. But I'm going to put you in a bit of a mat there and ask you this question. You are right to say we have not taken one structural reform. We've actually taken 2, if I may add a third one, RERA as well. Are you making a case for fiscal expansion of almost 100 basis points then?
I am not going to commit myself, Supriya, to any of these numbers, because that really is the realm of the Department of Economic Affairs, and they are the guardians of this. I am merely saying that the time has come to not be constrained by self-imposed limits on the fiscal expenditure when the economy needs this push. And I am also saying that one should not get overawed and cowed down by the rating agencies, which in my view would look at our growth prospects and our employment prospects much more closely than they would look at increase in our debt to GDP ratio. And finally, that's a ratio. And I think the time has come to grow the denominator, which is the GDP, rather than try and control the numerator. And that's what I'm urging to do, because not just for growth, but for the much more critical issue, and which is employment generation in the economy.
Since you did touch upon the banks, Dr. Kumar, obviously there is a concern on the fact that PSU banks are unable to lend right now, and many believe that there is a case for infusion of more capital in the PSU banks. Would you support that cause, that the government's PSU recapitalization plan needs to be sort of enhanced in some sort of a way, maybe pump in 40-50,000 crores into PSU banks? Or do you believe that, you know, good money should not chase, you know, bad money in some sense, and the taxpayers' money should not be used to recapitalize PSU banks? What is your own view on that?
Again, a two-part answer, Sandeep, which is one, you know, we should not look at the credit offtake from the PSBs in isolation. You have to look at it, you know, in conjunction with what's happened in the IPOs, you know, the equity offerings, what's happened in the corporate bond market, you know, where there has been a huge offtake of credit by the corporations, and also by some growth in the external commercial borrowing. So I'm merely saying that to keep harping upon the sort of credit downturn from the private sector public sector banks may not be the right thing to do, because if you look at the private sector banks like HDFC and, you know, and Kotak, etc., they have actually hiked up their credit, expanded their credit quite smartly. And then, as I mentioned, there is also the corporate bond market. On the second issue, which is the recapitalization of public sector banks, I think after all the cleaning up that has been done, it may be unfair to say that this is good money down, you know, along with the bad money. I think there is, you know, and because of the insolvency law now in place, because of the RBI having forced these public sector banks to recognize, you know, the bad loans and then to start taking action on them. I think there is huge, unprecedented structural reform now being undertaken to get the public sector banks to clean up their act and get, you know, and get greater efficiency. The only thing that I wanted to add here was that, you know, given that 70% or more of our banking sector is sovereign guaranteed, I am not sure whether the Basel III is actually applicable or should be applicable to us, because after all our banks are pretty much guaranteed against any default, you know, by a sovereign guarantee. So therefore one should re-look at these capital ratio, capital requirements, capital adequacy requirements, and also try and see whether you know, our banks can do with lower amounts of capital, and then find that capital, and the sooner we do that, the better.
You know, Dr. Kumar, you're giving me a cue for my next question. So, you know, I'm just going to ask you a point-blank question. Many people believe that the situation in the banking
which I keep doing, Supriya. I keep giving you cues.
A lot of people out there believe that the new provisioning norms are actually making the situation look worse than before. So is there a case also to revisit the provisioning norms in the banking space, just like there is a need to revisit the Basel III norm compliance?
Having left the RBI board recently, I would agree with you entirely that there is a case for re-looking at the provisioning norms, and also, for example, any such action like saying that if the corporate is non-compliant by a day or a week, then therefore, you know, that particular loan should be immediately called a non-performing loan, as I believe has been put out by one of the regulators in the recent days. I think those things are extreme. We don't need to do that. And I think therefore there is some merit in thinking, not in perpetual evergreening of loans. I am certainly not for it, but there is some merit perhaps in the banks giving a little bit of you know, longer rope to those projects which may be struck especially because of non-receipt of payments from public sector or government agencies. And I know that there are a large number of such cases where the payments from the government departments or agencies, state or central, have been delayed, and that's then sort of has a throwback on the corporate you know, ability to service that loan, and therefore on the banking sector. I think those cases need to be carefully identified, and provisioning norms apply differently to them.
RBI board, Dr. Kumar, are you also sort of exasperated at the pace at which the central bank has cut rates over the last 6 to 12 months? And do you believe that still there is a window for the RBI to act before the government moves in with some sort of a fiscal policy to stimulate the economy? Do you think now is the window? We've got a policy coming up in October.
You know, it's always better for both monetary and fiscal policy to act in tandem, you know, to create the right kind of, environment and to create the right kind of push for the economy to get on to the up cycle, you know, to the rising cycle of the rising of the business cycle, the rising curve of the business cycle. So I would really urge the RBI to think very carefully and to consider very carefully, what his inflationary expectations are, and maybe even to look at not headline inflation but at core inflation, because headline inflation tends to be seasonal and includes fuel and food, which are not really amenable to interest rate movements, and which therefore are affected far more by supply side problems rather than controlling, rather than a demand side management. So yes, I would urge the RBI to work in tandem and in sync with the government, so that both the fiscal and the monetary policy are seen to be getting a revival, to be helping the revival, which I am saying is already on, and to gather pace as we move forward.
As a former finance minister once said, the government shouldn't be walking alone as far as the path of growth is concerned. It has to be both fiscal and monetary policy, and that's a pragmatic view, which is why I like economists like yourselves who have the ear close to the ground. But I'm going to take this back and link it to the fiscal stimulus, sir. And, while there is a fear that if fiscal stimulus were to come, it is going to be inflationary, it may stoke inflation because it may create demand. What do you believe the nature of the stimulus needs to be? Should it be one that stimulates, creates demand, induces demand and consumption, or should fiscal expansion be used for infrastructure investments? Should it be more consumption oriented or investment oriented?
Supriya, the first thing one must agree on is whether there is excess capacity in the economy or not. And if there is excess capacity, and if there is the output gap, where the actual output is below the potential output, then of course it is the demand which has to be raised, and it is demand which is therefore the culprit, and therefore which has to be which has to be brought up to get the revival get the revival going. But the second issue is, of course, that public expenditure should be, in an economy like ours, productivity enhancing and capital in nature. I am not a pure Keynesian in that term, because in my view we have so much more potential to raise output by improving our infrastructure, by improving our irrigation methods, etc., etc. So I think any expenditure, any public expenditure should be directed much more at capacity expansion and productivity enhancement, which is why my insistence on saying that the revenue deficit target should be adhered to, and not only should be adhered to, but should in some sense be overdone, so that we use our public expenditure to improve the supply side response from the economy, which is a far more sustainable basis for getting growth, which is non-inflationary and which is therefore more sustainable and employment generating.
Right. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, I just want to throw a contrarian view, because, I must confess, we have sort of supported stimulus for growth. Last week, we ran 3 debates on this very program on the issue of stimulus for growth. But one view that came about from a section of economists is that if you're going to put in more money for public expenditure, for infrastructure projects, that'll have a long gestation periods. By the time you see that kick in, it'll take 9 to 12 months, by which time you may probably not need a stimulus. So that could in turn be inflationary. How would you counter that argument, sir?
Well, I completely disagree with that argument, actually, because there are ways of doing the productivity enhancement and public capital expenditure, And I think there are, what we need to do is to bring in public expenditure which will crowd in private investment as much as possible. Now, I just give you two examples. For if the government allocation for affordable housing was to be raised, and raised more than what they already have, a significant amount in the budget, and that amount, that additional amount was being utilized for bringing in private builders and private contractors to build these houses in very short time, because now there are technologies which can build you houses in less than 6 weeks. So therefore, all this talk about the gestation period, etc., maybe just that. But yeah, you are right. If the governance capability of the government is seen to be very weak, then of course the gestation periods can be enormous. But on the other hand, if we can manage to get our act together and de-risk the project, for example, let's say in the highways or in the housing sector or in the suburban railways, get all the necessary approvals in place and then issue a EPC tender for the builders and for the contractors and large companies to come in. It's not essential, it's not taken for granted that you will not get money out there to be used with all its multiplier effects to get the supply response going, because the demand for capital goods and for productivity enhancement, productivity enhancing sort of demand expenditure will be there from the private sector. So the idea is to undertake public capital expenditure which is crowding in, which is of a crowding in nature, and that I think will neither be inflationary nor necessarily have a long gestation period. You don't necessarily always have to build dams and long bridges. You can do other things as well by this public expenditure.
No, I appreciate your point, and I also appreciate the point that the whole idea of public sector expenditure is to crowd in the private investment. But I'm going to put two views before you. Kumar Mangalam Birla, in an interview with Sandeep just a few weeks back, had said that private investment will kick in, or we're still about 18 months away from big ticket private investment to kick in. You have L&T CFO talk about private investment cycle being at least 24 months away. When do you realistically expect private investment to begin breaking ground?
Well, I mean, those are very heavy voices to be faced with. So I won't dare give a number in some sense. But my only submission is that if we do the necessary debottlenecking, and if we direct our public capital expenditure in the right manner, and if we get those expenditures which are already within the budget to move from different expenditure departments of the government, I just cannot see why the private sector investment would be 18 to 24 months away. Yes, there is a qualification which Mr. Birla said about big ticket items, maybe there, but not all private investment is about big ticket items. Private investment could also be about improving our export supply. Private sector investment could also be about, as I said earlier, affordable housing, and private sector investment could also be about improving our productivity in agriculture and taking up lots of downstream projects in agriculture where there is a lot of value to be added and good returns to be made. So I beg to disagree with those doyens of Indian industry, and actually urge them to therefore look again at what they can do to bring in private investment, not necessarily big ticket, but substantial in any case.
The other concern, Dr. Kumar, in the economy is,
and there is one other thing, Supriya, that I want to add.
Sure, please go ahead.
I always maintain that it is always important to look at what I call the next 1,000. We keep talking only about the top 100 corporates and industrialists in this country, but they probably are in a situation where they have got a bit of an investment inertia, if you like. But the next 1,000, that's where the hunger for growth is. That's where they've got in some sense already cash surpluses which are waiting to be invested, and that's the set of companies which will come, in my view, roaring in if they found that the revival is on and the government is doing something to accelerate that revival. So it is that set of companies which I think we should be focused on rather than our top 100, which are already doing their bit to whatever extent they can.
Right. The next 1,000 companies, Dr. Kumar, many of them are MSMEs, and many of them are sort of export-driven growth, are betting on export-driven growth. And I want to touch upon the export sector, because that is a pain point. I mean, I think it's no rocket science to come to the conclusion that for the economy to grow at 8 to 10%, exports need to grow at a far faster pace than the current 2%, which is what they're growing at. What can the government do to incentivize exports as a whole? Because there's a currency play here as well. Obviously, there are more immediate concerns on account of GST, refund not coming through, and I'm sure that is being addressed in the right platform. But what can the government do structurally to push exports? Because there is a rupee play. You've got countries like China which have used the currency to boost their competitiveness. What is your own view? Because there's one thinking that a strong rupee reflects the strength of the economy. Many believe there's a case to allow the rupee to depreciate as well, to reflect the true global picture. What is your view, sir?
For several years, some of us like Shankaracharya, Surjit Bhalla, myself, I think also Arvind Virmani, some of the, I dare say they are some of the leading voices on the economic policy in this country, have maintained that India cannot grow without having a weak currency, without having a relatively depreciated currency. And also this view has been reinforced by the World Bank Commission led by Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate Michael Spence, who worked out that all economies in Asia which have had a sustained 10-year period or more of double-digit or high single-digit growth have been those which have had a mild degree of financial repression and a depreciated currency. And I think and they looked at a large number of countries for doing so. I don't think India can be an exception. And I urge therefore the RBI to look at that very carefully. The argument that our depreciated currency will stoke up inflation, I think is not, it doesn't stand to scrutiny, because what happens very often when prices rise is that demand gets reduced rather than demand remaining constant. And there is therefore a price elasticity even for our imports, whether they be energy or capital goods, or even perhaps to a certain extent defense. In fact, a depreciated currency, a weak, relatively depreciated currency would encourage make in India rather than encourage import to India, which is what we have seen in the last 6 months, where imports have increased rapidly at the expense sometimes of our domestic producers. So therefore, I am very clear in my mind that in fact what I have said is that we should somehow assure our exporters that in the next 5 years the rupee will never go beyond 100 on its REER index, and it will remain below that.
Dr. Kumar, I do want to turn focus and talk to an issue that we've discussed with you when you wore only your economist hat and you weren't the vice chairman of NITI Aayog. The government's track record on divestment, because for all of this to happen, stimulus to happen, you will need resources. The government's track record on divestment hasn't been exemplary, and I would say that for previous government as well. Every government has missed a divestment target for the last 10 years now. Are you as the vice chairman of NITI Aayog a votary of privatization? Are you going to push the government to sell more strategic stake? Why does the government need to be in businesses it has no business to be in? Hotels, airlines and things like that.
Supriya, even before I joined NITI Aayog, and by the way I still remain an economist, despite the fact that I have become the vice chairman of NITI Aayog. I hope I become a better economist. Before I joined, my colleagues here have already sent out a list of, I think, 23 enterprises where the government needs to disinvest, and some of them actually include a strategic sale, where the government need to just get out of those businesses. And you've seen this government put Air India out for sale, and they've been very candid about it. The cabinet has taken the decision. So there are these very clear signals, and in fact not just signals, it's measures, steps by this government to get on with this investment and in strategic privatization of public sector units which are not performing so well. I think this is now under very active consideration. of what is called DIPAM, which is the disinvestment department in the government, and from NITI Aayog we will try and push for the target of 25,000 crore from disinvestment received to be exceeded, well beyond that, because I think the markets are good. We can therefore get a good value for our sales, and we need that money to be invested in the in improving our public capital expenditure. So yes, I'm all for it, and I'm not for a minute going to be saying that we need to somehow we need to slow down this pace that the government has already decided to follow even before I joined NITI Aayog.
Dr. Kumar, I want to talk about the other issue that you have spoken again at length to us at ET Now, which is on job creation, which I'm sure you would agree is one of the big red on the report card of this government, inability to create jobs as over the last 3 years. And considering that we're going to be staring at a situation where 10 to 12 million youth are going to be joining the workforce and creating jobs at a pace of about 1 million a year, it is going to be a massive challenge. And I'm happy that you are heading a panel, that the government has constituted a panel under your leadership to come up with ways to create jobs. Now, I don't want to preempt what this panel will do, but from your vantage point, sir, where do you think are the jobs going to come from? Because if you were to look at it in a more granular manner, sector by sector, there's disruption, there's consolidation, and one doesn't get visibility of which are the sectors where jobs are going to be created.
No, that's a tough one, but that's also the most important one, and that's also the most critical one. First, I think I owe it to my friend T.N. Nainan, who has brought out the fact that yes, there are 10 or 12 million young people added to the workforce every year, but he sort of made out very clearly that that number has to be reduced considerably to those who are actually actively looking for jobs, because we have to take into view consideration the female participation rate in the workforce, and then those who may be longer in the academic, on the education field, etc. So it may not be that big a number. Having said that, I think it still is a very large number to find employment for, and I think this government therefore has done rather well to start off the Mudra program, which is meant for improving the self-employed, the situation of the self-employed, and I believe there are about 7 odd crore of loans that have been given out for people not only to be self-employed but to expand their employment, or to give employment to others. Even with that, though, there is a huge aspiration among the young people to find what Francois Bourgogne, the former chief economist of the World Bank, called they want good jobs. The young people want good jobs, and these will come from the formal sectors of the economy, and these sectors would cut across manufacturing and services, and therefore you have sectors like tourism, you have sectors like education and healthcare and exports, handicrafts, all of those, and exports can be light engineering, can be textiles and garments and gems and jewelry. I think those are all the segments where you will need to where jobs would have to be generated, and the government, that we have set up a task force on employment and exports. We've had our first meeting. We are looking at these sectors in a very granular manner as to where what is holding back the job expansion, the job creation and growth in these sectors. We'll hopefully come up with our report in a month, so give us that much time. But the other thing, of course, is that we can actually accelerate our apprenticeship program, so that and the government has announced that already. I believe the government is prepared to share up to 25% of the cost of hiring an apprentice, and these are very useful things, because companies who hire apprentices do that for a forward-looking reason, because they hire them because in places where they need. I think a little more can be done there right away, and NITI Aayog would look at measures that can be taken to push up this program, which will directly benefit our young people's job prospects in the economy.
I can only say we seem to be in safe hands with you as the head of the panel, and I know I'm reaching my time with you. I'll just take quick last 5 minutes. I will do a follow-up question on jobs, Dr. Kumar, and this has to do with the fact that a lot of people believe it's time for India to look at another IT, to create another IT sector. And a lot of people believe it could be healthcare. Could healthcare be India's next IT? And IT happened because there were policy enablers, because there were incentives. Do you believe healthcare can be looked at through that lens?
Health, not specifically healthcare, but a clutch of services sectors. You know, it could be healthcare, education, also tourism, etc., as I mentioned earlier to you. And by the way, do please also remember that IT takeoff was was largely self-driven and based on external demand. So therefore, again in this case, I think our private sector would do well, as they are already beginning to do, to look at the sources of external demand for our services sector, the three that I mentioned. And the government, but you know, the world is a bit different today. Industry 4.0 is upon us, and there is a huge amount of robotization and automation and artificial intelligence, etc., which is all going on out there, so that the nature and the structure of demand is beginning to change. India can't really hope to depend entirely on its wage arbitrage to get this growth going in these sectors. So we need to be thinking much smarter, and we need to embrace the new technologies while actually going for for these takes. But may I point you towards two industries which can be the new IT in this country. One is the e-mobility, and that if we can really get on to that curve, we can actually be leading the world, because now the prices of the batteries, etc., is falling down rapidly. And the second one is logistics, because those are both. The second one is hugely underdeveloped. And I think those are the two industries where you might see where there is a huge potential for real expansion of job opportunities, and I hope this will happen sooner than later. Very quickly, Dr. Kumar, one is on the politics of empowerment versus politics of entitlement, and you've always been a champion of the politics of empowerment, but there is a little bit of concern, with the sort of spate of farm loan waivers issued by state governments, and now the Power for All program that has been announced by the government just yesterday, Free Power for All. How would you assuage concerns that, we aren't going back to the politics of entitlement that we thought this country is rejected? No, I have a very short answer for that one, and simply because it is not in the DNA of this government to go for the policies of entitlement. I think that's been demonstrated. That has been demonstrated very clearly and repeatedly, that this government is about empowerment, and I think it is now also very clear that it is about empowering actually those who are excluded, that this government is going to pursue. And I dare say that there are very it will be very hard put, anybody would be very hard put to claim otherwise, that this government has been populist in any measure so far, and I don't think that's true at all.
So one final question before I let you go: how is NITI Aayog going to play, and what sort of a role do you expect NITI Aayog to play under you in transforming India, considering there's now this PMEAC and there's also advice coming in within the finance ministry? I'm just asking you, NITI Aayog under you, and what sort of a role will you see that play in transforming India, sir?
I have to tell you honestly that it's far too early for me to comment on that. I am trying to find my way. I am trying to get my feet into trying to find my feet here. Changes are happening. The PMEAC has been announced only yesterday, so we will try and figure out as to what is NITI Aayog's role. The only thing I can say at this stage, that I visualize NITI Aayog as a funnel with its mouth very much open to the whole community of ideas and innovative ideas, and then to be funneling it in and crystallizing that and inputting them into various governments such that we are more focused on how to do things and how to do things better, rather than just simply talking about what to do, which is very often now already quite known. But quite honestly, our role will be discovered, as it were, or we'll find our role as we go along. I'm not sure at this time as to what can that be in more specific terms.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, for taking time out and joining us on the India Development Debate this Tuesday evening. Appreciate you answering all those questions and giving those clarifications on a whole host of issues that need to be discussed right now. Thanks for joining us. Now, that was an India Development Debate direct with Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman, NITI Aayog. We don't do debates for the sake of doing debates. We want to champion change, and we're delighted to see the government on board with an agenda for growth.
Now, viewers, over the last 10 days, we have repeatedly put the spotlight on crucial economic issues, and we are glad that even Dr. Kumar agrees on most of those. The key takeaways from an exclusive interview are here for your consumption. There is a need for stimulus to pump prime the Indian economy. We need to recapitalize public sector banks and take lead from Basel III norms if warranted. Let the rupee weaken to support exports that are languishing at growth rates of just 2%. Push the pedal on strategic divestment and do it more aggressively. And there will be a report on creating and fueling more jobs that will be out in a month's time. So this is the big interview. We've got to the big takeaways. Thank you very much for keeping your date with the India Development Debate.
Keep it with ET now. Up next is Top 10 at 10. Good night.